What if the person you thought you lost forever was living a whole life just steps away and you never even knew? He was just picking up cold medicine when the magazine stopped him cold. On the glossy cover, a teenage boy soared midair on a basketball court. Black, graceful, powerful. Kevin Larson, America's Next Phenomenon. The headline read, "Josh Cole stared. The name hit first, then the eyes. His eyes. 17 years ago, he walked out of a hospital room after looking at a newborn baby and saying the words, 'No child should ever have to carry.' This can't be mine." He left without a backward glance. No name on the birth certificate. No child support. Just silence. And now here was that same boy turned into a national headline, a living mirror of the man who had denied him. Josh's hands trembled as he grabbed the magazine. His breath caught. The store around him blurred. The past had just slammed into his chest full force. And for the first time in 17 years, Josh Cole couldn't look away. Because the son he tried to erase had just found a way to be unforgettable. Josh Cole wasn't thinking about the past that day. He wasn't thinking about 17 years ago, or the hospital room he left behind, or the decision that had kept him awake more nights than he cared to admit. He was thinking about his sinuses, about how cold Boston had gotten and how the heater in his old apartment never seemed to work right. He rubbed his forehead as he stood in line at the pharmacy, scrolling through emails on his phone, half listening to the hum of idle conversations and the beeping register. That's when he saw it just to the left of the counter on the wire rack of weekly magazines, a splash of bold color, a boy in midair, not just any boy, that boy. Josh's heart skipped. The magazine read, Sports Illustrated Junior, and the cover photo was electric, a teenage basketball player soaring above defenders, frozen in the kind of moment athletes dream of. Black skin glistening with sweat, arms extended, eyes focused, confident, fearless. The headline screamed, "Kevin Larson, the next big thing." Josh stared at the name first, then the face, and then he couldn't breathe. His feet felt like concrete. The checkout line disappeared. So did the people, the lights, the dull hum of music in the background. Everything collapsed into that one glossy rectangle, and the pair of eyes that stared back at him from the page, eyes that were unmistakably his. Josh took a step forward slowly, as if approaching a ghost. He picked up the magazine, hands trembling, his throat tightening with something too old to name. The boy was 17. Of course he was. Born that night. The night Josh said, "This can't be mine." But it was, and the proof was staring him in the face, immortalized in ink on sale for $5.99. The boy on the cover wasn't just any rising star. He was suspended midair in a moment that felt almost unreal, legs tucked, fingertips grazing the rim. His entire body arched like a sculpted question mark, hung between gravity and destiny. He wore number 21, the jersey dark with sweat, the gym lights casting a silver sheen across his forehead. The crowd behind him was blurred in motion, cheering, but their noise couldn't touch the stillness of that photograph. His face was the only thing in sharp, startling focus. And it was that face that made Josh Cole's stomach twist into knots. The longer he looked, the harder it became to breathe. There were the cheekbones sharper than his, but familiar. The line of the jaw, young, proud, determined. But it was the eyes that shattered him. They weren't just familiar, they were identical. Eyes like mirrors, like time-traveling ghosts. Josh had looked into those eyes before 17 years ago for all of 20 seconds before he turned his back on them. And now here they were again, bold and unafraid, on full display in a grocery store magazine rack. Kevin's eyes looked straight through the camera lens, straight through the air, straight through Josh's paper-thin resolve. They didn't accuse. They didn't forgive. They simply existed. They were. And in their quiet certainty, Josh felt everything he had buried surge to the surface: shame, regret, awe, fear. This boy, this beautiful, powerful boy, had become something extraordinary without him. And yet somehow he carried pieces of Josh's face like a secret truth no one else had noticed. Until now. Josh clutched the magazine tighter. No caption could explain what those eyes were doing to him. The past wasn't just back, It was looking straight at him. Josh stood frozen, the magazine gripped in both hands, as if it might slip through his fingers and vanish. His palms were damp, his knuckles bone-white with pressure, but he couldn't loosen his grip, not on this. Not now. The world around him had slowed to a crawl. The hum of fluorescent lights above flickered softly, the only sound in an otherwise muffled store. Conversations faded into distant murmurs. The beep of the register, once steady and rhythmic, now seemed to echo from another dimension. Josh couldn't hear the cashier calling for the next customer. He didn't register the woman behind him, shifting impatiently, or the sliding of carts across tile. It was all background noise dissolved into static. The only thing real was the image in his hands, the boy on the cover, and the electric storm building inside his chest. His breath became shallow-clipped, like each inhale had to navigate the sharp edges of something breaking. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd gone 17 years carefully stepping around the memories, avoiding hospitals' photos, even certain streets in Boston. And yet, here it was, undeniable, unrelenting, staring up at him from the glossy paper like a verdict. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stood there, trembling, utterly hollowed out by the recognition that he was looking at the boy he'd once rejected with a single sentence. This can't be mine. But it was. It had always been. And now, surrounded by the hum of cold lighting and the indifferent rhythm of a pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon, Josh Cole found himself in the crosshairs of a moment that demanded something no silence could protect him from truth. Josh didn't remember leaving the pharmacy. His legs moved, his hands paid, his body walked out onto the sidewalk like it was on autopilot. But his mind was somewhere else, entirely still locked on the face of the boy in the photograph. The cold air slapped against his cheeks, but he didn't feel it. He slid into the driver's seat of his car, shut the door, and just sat there, the silence wrapping around him like fog. The magazine rested on his lap, the cover slightly bent from the pressure of his grip. Kevin's face stared back at him, frozen in motion, suspended mid-jump with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. Josh couldn't look away. He traced the outline of Kevin's jaw with his eyes, the curve of his arm, the fire in his expression. 17 years. 17 years he had avoided this exact moment. And yet here it was, in full color and full clarity, resting on his knees like a judgment he'd postponed too long. His fingers brushed the edge of the photo again, as if the texture might tell him something more, some hidden detail, some explanation. But there was none. Just Kevin. Alive. Brilliant. Unreachable. Josh leaned his head against the steering wheel, the magazine still open, and closed his eyes for a moment. But Kevin's face was still there, burned into the backs of his eyelids like a memory reawakened by force. He opened them again and looked down. This time he didn't try to make sense of anything. He just stared at the boy, at the sun, at the stranger who shared his eyes, and let the silence of the car cradle him in the quiet weight of everything he'd left unsaid. The smell of antiseptic clung to the hospital air, sharp and sterile, as Josh stood awkwardly near the edge of the delivery room, hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, like he didn't know what to do with them. The walls were too white, the lights too bright, everything humming with a tension he couldn't name. Brenda lay on the bed, exhausted, her hair matted to her forehead, her chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. There was blood on the sheets, sweat on her neck, but in her arms there was peace. A newborn wrapped tightly in a pale blue blanket, his tiny fingers curled into fists, his head resting against her shoulder. The nurse smiled as she approached Josh with gentle hands, lifting the baby slightly and offering him forward. "Would you like to hold your son?" she asked. For a moment time held its breath. Josh took a small step forward, hesitated, then leaned in to look closer. That's when he saw the dark skin, the tight curl of hair, the unmistakable color that told him everything he didn't want to face. His heart dropped, his jaw tensed. He didn't take the baby. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Brenda, too drained to speak, and back at the boy. Then he stepped back, blinked hard, and shook his head as if the whole thing was some kind of mistake that could be undone. The doctor moved, gently lifting the baby from Brenda's arms with practiced care. his voice calm as he said, "Congratulations, you have a healthy baby boy." The bundle was small, barely more than 6 pounds, wrapped in a hospital-issued blanket with a little blue cap that sat slightly crooked on his head. As the doctor turned and extended the child toward Josh, there was no mistaking what Josh saw: skin the color of rich earth hair, dark, and coiled, a nose too wide, lips too full. The baby was undeniably black. Not mixed in a way Josh had imagined, no trace of his fair complexion, no ambiguity. The boy didn't look like him at all, and in that instant the world around him seemed to fracture. His throat tightened. The fluorescent lights above suddenly felt too hot. He didn't reach for the baby. He didn't move. His mind was racing, his heart pounding against his ribs like a warning. The doctor, unaware of the emotional eruption taking place, held the child for another beat before gently setting him back down beside Brenda. Josh took a small step backward, his voice caught somewhere between denial and fear. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the child he had imagined. He had come expecting something familiar, something safe, something that looked like him. Instead, he was being asked to claim a truth he had spent months refusing to consider. Josh stepped back instinctively, as if the baby posed some kind of threat he wasn't prepared to face. His eyes flicked from the infant's dark skin to Brenda's tear-streaked face, searching for an answer, for an excuse, for some version of reality that would allow him to escape what his gut already knew. "No," he whispered, barely audible, the words sticking in his throat like splinters. He shook his head once, then again, more firmly, his voice rising in disbelief. "No. This can't be right. This can't be my son." Brenda's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked exhausted, devastated, as if the labor had taken everything she had, and now this final blow would take what was left. Josh's gaze hardened, not with anger, but with refusal, with a desperate need to protect the version of his life that didn't include this moment. "This isn't mine," he said again, louder now, backing further toward the door. The doctor shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them, sensing the emotional fault line cracking open beneath the surface. But Josh wasn't looking at anyone anymore. His world had narrowed to one sharp thought pulsing in his head: get out. His face was pale breath, shallow hands clenched in denial. The boy lay there quietly, not crying, just blinking up at the ceiling with soft, searching eyes. Eyes that mirrored Josh's if he'd only had the courage to see them. But he didn't. He looked away. He always looked away. Josh didn't speak another word. He didn't offer explanation or apology. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a plain white envelope thick with cash folded crisply, and placed it on the edge of the bedside table like someone leaving a tip after an uncomfortable meal. He didn't look at Brenda. He didn't look at the baby. His face had gone still, expressionless, like a man switching off every emotion just to keep from breaking. Brenda turned her head slowly toward him, lips parting as if to say something, maybe to beg, maybe to scream, but the words never came. Maybe she knew they wouldn't change anything. Josh adjusted the collar of his coat, took one last shallow breath, and walked toward the door with mechanical steps. Each footfall sounded louder than the last in the sterile quiet of the hospital room. The door opened with a soft creak, then clicked shut behind him. He never turned around. Not once. Not to glance back. Not to reconsider. He stepped into the hallway, past nurses, past machines, beeping in distant rooms, past the start of a life he was choosing to abandon. And as he disappeared around the corner, he left behind more than a baby and a woman. He left behind the truth, the weight of a name not written on a birth certificate. The beginning of a story he would spend the next 17 years trying not to remember. Back in the solitude of his apartment, the magazine still resting on the kitchen table like an open wound, Josh couldn't shake the image of the boy's face. Kevin. The name echoed in his mind with every breath, every glance at the glossy cover that refused to be ignored. He told himself not to look him up, not to dive into a past he had sealed shut for 17 years, but his hands moved on their own. Pulling his laptop closer, opening the browser, typing the name slowly, letter by letter as if it might summon a ghost. Kevin Larson basketball. The search exploded with results. Highlight reels, interviews, local news stories, photos of Kevin dunking, laughing with teammates, posing with medals. a YouTube video titled Kevin Larson, The Future of College Hoops, had over 1 million views. Josh clicked it. There was no hesitation left. The video began with Kevin walking into a packed gym, head-high earbuds and calm and focused. The crowd roared as he stepped onto the court, and then the footage cut to him slicing through defenders, flying toward the basket, releasing three-pointers with effortless confidence. He was electric. But it wasn't just the game that got to Josh. It was the way Kevin carried himself. Composed, grounded, like someone who knew where he came from, even if the man who helped bring him into the world had disappeared without a trace. Josh leaned back in his chair, stunned. This wasn't a boy anymore. This was a young man who had built a life from the silence he'd been left in. And the more Josh read, the more he realized Kevin hadn't just survived without him. He had become extraordinary because of it. Josh didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't even fully admit it to himself. He just found the schedule online, circled the date, and showed up. It was a chilly Friday night, the gym already buzzing with energy by the time he slipped inside. He wore a worn Red Sox cap, pulled low over his forehead, a dark jacket zipped to the collar, and stood near the back of the bleachers, pressed against the wall like a man trying not to exist. The crowd was loud, students shouting chants, parents waving signs, cheerleaders bouncing in rhythm, but Josh heard none of it. His eyes were locked on the court. And then Kevin appeared. He jogged out with his team earbuds dangling from his neck, face calm and unreadable. Josh's breath caught. Seeing him move in real life was different than watching on a screen. He was taller than Josh expected, lean but powerful every step, carrying a quiet assurance that spoke of discipline and purpose. When Kevin dribbled toward the bench and gave a brief nod to the coach, Josh felt something tighten in his chest. There was no trace of the baby he had once walked away from, only this composed, confident young man who had no idea his biological father was standing just 50 feet away. Josh didn't cheer. He didn't clap. He just stood there, a shadow among strangers, heart pounding as he watched Kevin take his first shot, a clean three-pointer that sailed through the net without touching the rim. The crowd erupted. Josh said nothing. But inside, something had cracked open. Josh had prepared himself for the athleticism, for the polished skill and the fluid motion of Kevin's game. He'd seen it online, had watched every video clip he could find, memorized every angle of his son's jump shot, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment. Kevin laughed. It was after a timeout. Something lighthearted was said on the bench, and Kevin threw his head back, eyes squinting, mouth open in a full, unguarded grin. It was a smile so effortless, so alive, that it cut straight through Josh like a blade. There was something devastating in how freely that joy radiated from him, untouched by the shadow of a man who had once refused to claim him. Josh had no right to it, yet he couldn't stop staring. The tilt of Kevin's head, the way his eyes disappeared when he laughed, that was familiar. Hauntingly so. It was a mirror of Josh's own expression from years ago, caught in old photographs, long before shame had dulled his edges. The pain that bloomed in his chest wasn't just guilt. It was mourning. Mourning the 17 years he had missed of this boy's life, birthdays, scraped knees, game day breakfasts, inside jokes, teenage heartbreaks, the simple magic of watching a child grow into himself. And now here, Kevin was laughing with people who had earned their place in his world, while Josh stood hidden in the shadows like a stranger trying to steal a glimpse of something he once discarded. The smile didn't accuse. It didn't need to. Its brightness only reminded Josh how much darker his own world had become without it. Josh didn't move from his place against the wall. He stood still, arms folded tightly across his chest, not because he was cold, but because it was the only way to keep himself from falling apart. Every instinct told him to take a step forward, to walk down the bleachers, to find Kevin after the game and say something, anything. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he watched from a distance, eyes tracking Kevin's every movement like a man trying to memorize what he'd never had the courage to claim. The way Kevin ran the floor, the way his teammates looked to him for cues, the way the coach clapped his shoulder and trusted him with the final play, it was all evidence of a life Josh had never touched, but had somehow helped begin. And that thought alone made his feet feel rooted in cement. What right did he have to come closer, to interrupt a life that had clearly flourished in his absence? There was no invitation waiting for him, no open door, just the ache of recognition and the silent weight of regret. When the final buzzer sounded and Kevin raised his arm in triumph, the crowd surged around him, students chanting his name, parents snapping photos, friends wrapping him in hugs. Josh remained exactly where he was, unmoving, uninvited, unseen. From a distance, Kevin looked like everything Josh had once feared and now everything he longed for, a living, breathing testament to the life he'd run from. So he stayed in the shadows, invisible by choice, because sometimes the deepest punishment isn't being pushed away. It's knowing you were never brave enough to step forward when it mattered. Josh sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. His laptop screen glowed in the dim light, casting a pale reflection on his tired face. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, then slowly began to type, "Brenda, I don't know if you'll ever read this." He paused, stared at the words, and deleted them. He tried again. "I saw Kevin play last night." He's delete. "I'm sorry for leaving." Delete. Each sentence felt wrong, too hollow or too heavy, too selfish or too late. He would write a line, reread it, then erase it in silence, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat filled with hesitation. There were too many things to say, and no right way to say any of them. How do you apologize for abandoning a child before his first breath? For walking out of a hospital and disappearing for 17 years? For forfeiting the right to call yourself father? Josh leaned back in his chair, rubbed his eyes, then started typing again, slower this time. "You don't owe me a response. I just needed to say that I see him now. I see what I missed. I see what I ran from. And I'm sorry." He stared at the words for a long time, the cursor blinking at the end like a dare. Then he hovered over the send button. His hand trembled. His chest felt hollow. After several minutes of stillness, he hit backspace again. Every word deleted in silence. He closed the laptop. Another message unsent. Another apology swallowed by fear. Josh lost count of how many versions he wrote. Some were long, spilling into paragraphs where he tried to explain himself, justify his silence, or describe the guilt that had gnawed at him for years. Others were short and abrupt, bare apologies with no details, as if fewer words might somehow soften the truth. He wrote about the hospital, about the envelope of cash, about the way he walked out and never looked back. But every draft felt like it was written for him, not for Brenda, and certainly not for Kevin. He wasn't looking for forgiveness, but a part of him kept trying to earn it anyway. He hated how easily the delete key had become his refuge. Over and over he would stare at a block of text, read it aloud in a whisper, then highlight the entire thing and press backspace, watching the words vanish like they'd never existed. He didn't deserve closure. He didn't deserve peace. But he needed something. Some proof that Kevin was alive and okay, even if it came with cold indifference or silence. So finally, after another sleepless night, he opened a new message and typed a single line. No greeting, no sign-off. Just, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just need to know my son is okay." He stared at it, fingers hovering above the keyboard, heart pounding with the quiet panic of someone laying their soul bare in 12 words. This time he didn't delete it. He didn't overthink. He just hit send. The message left the screen with a soft whoosh, and for the first time in 17 years, so did a small trembling piece of Josh's guarded heart. 3 days passed. Josh checked his email more times than he cared to admit, refreshing his inbox every few hours, despite telling himself not to expect a reply. There was nothing. No read receipt, no bounce back. Just silence, the kind of silence he was used to, but that now cut deeper because this time he had actually reached out. He told himself it was fine, that Brenda had every right to ignore him. Still, each empty morning felt heavier than the last. Then, on the third day, as he stepped out to grab his usual black coffee from the corner store, he noticed something different in the mailbox. A single unmarked envelope sat wedged between a grocery flyer and a takeout menu. No return address, just his name, Josh Cole, scrawled in unmistakably familiar handwriting, the same careful strokes he remembered from notes Brenda used to leave on the fridge. His fingers hesitated before picking it up, heart lurching into his throat. Back inside his apartment, he sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where he had written and erased so many drafts. With slow, deliberate hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a folded sheet of paper. The photo showed Kevin at around 6 years old, grinning wide, clutching a basketball nearly half his size. He was missing one front tooth. His eyes were bright alive. Josh stared at the image for a long time before unfolding the paper. There were only 8 words written in clean, steady ink. He's okay now. Because you weren't there. Josh didn't cry. He couldn't. The grief sat too deep, too quiet. But the weight of those words landed with finality. The truth had arrived, unforgiving, but honest. Josh sat motionless at the table, the photograph resting in his open palm like a fragile relic from a life he was never part of. In the image, Kevin couldn't have been older than 6. He wore an oversized blue t-shirt and basketball shorts that hung awkwardly around his knees. The ball he held was almost too big for his arms, but he gripped it with pride, his little chest puffed out, his grin wide and gap-toothed. There was a light in his eyes, a pure and innocent brightness that spoke of a childhood not without struggle, but without the shadow of the man who'd abandoned him. Josh studied the contours of his son's face, still round with baby fat, but already sharp at the jaw, already carrying hints of who he would grow up to be. And there, unmistakably, were his own eyes staring back at him, only younger, freer, untouched by fear. He turned to the note next, a single strip of paper folded cleanly down the middle, the handwriting deliberate, steady, unmistakably Brenda's. He unfolded it slowly, almost afraid of what he might find, but knowing he deserved every word. And then he read it. He's okay now. Because you weren't there. 8 words. No more, no less. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't written in anger. It was a statement. A fact. A truth sharpened by time and motherhood, and all the nights Brenda must have spent comforting a child who never knew why his father had disappeared. Josh read the sentence again. And again. Each time it cut a little deeper, not because it was unfair, but because it was fair in the most devastating way. Kevin had grown up strong, kind, talented without him. His presence had never been required. In fact, his absence may have been the very thing that allowed Kevin to flourish. That realization didn't absolve Josh, it buried him further. He hadn't just missed out on his son's life, he had forfeited the right to even imagine himself as necessary. All he could do now was sit there gripping the photo, letting those 8 words settle into the silence he had created 17 years ago. Josh kept going back. Game after game, week after week, he returned to the same gymnasiums and arenas, some small and crowded, others echoing with the roar of packed bleachers, but always from the shadows. He wore the same Red Sox cap, the same dark jacket zipped high, and sat in the farthest corners of the stands where no one would notice him. He never brought a phone out to film, never cheered, never clapped. He simply watched. Quiet. Unseen. Kevin never knew he was there, and that was exactly how Josh wanted it. He didn't come to be forgiven or recognized, he came because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Watching Kevin move across the court, fearless and focused, had become a strange kind of ritual, a private penance for the 17 years he had vanished. Sometimes Josh arrived before the gym even opened, just to sit alone and absorb the atmosphere, the tension, the rhythm of a life he'd never belonged to. Other times, he stayed long after the final buzzer, watching Kevin laugh with teammates, sign autographs for little kids, drape a towel over his shoulders like a seasoned pro. No one ever stopped him. No one ever noticed the man who hovered just beyond the light. But Josh noticed everything, every point, every pass, every flash of expression on Kevin's face. He collected those moments like borrowed time snapshots of a son he didn't deserve but couldn't stop needing to see. Watching from a distance had become the closest he knew to fatherhood. It happened fast, the kind of moment that turns a gymnasium from thunder to silence in an instant. Kevin had gone up for a contested layup midair, like always fearless, but came down awkwardly, his ankle twisting beneath him with a sickening bend that Josh saw clearly, even from the farthest bleacher. Kevin hit the court hard, grabbing his leg, face contorted in pain. The crowd gasped, then went still as trainers rushed out and the coach knelt beside him. Josh didn't breathe. His hands clenched the metal rail in front of him, every muscle in his body taut with panic. For a long, suspended moment, he couldn't move. He wasn't a father in that moment. He was just a man watching his son hurt and unable to do anything about it. Kevin was helped up one arm over each shoulder of the assistant coaches, barely putting weight on his foot, grimacing. The crowd applauded as he was led off the court, but Josh didn't clap. He followed, quietly, at a distance. He slipped out of the bleachers and into the side hallway, careful not to be seen. When Kevin disappeared into the double doors marked Emergency Medical, Josh stood just outside them, staring at the bold red letters as if willing himself to cross the line. But he didn't. He couldn't. He just stood there in the corridor, fists in his pockets, heart pounding, listening to muffled voices and the distant beeping of machines. For 20 minutes he waited unmoving, hoping for news, for a glimpse, for anything. But no one came out to say his son would be okay because no one knew he was there. Josh followed the ambulance in silence, his car trailing behind it like a shadow, too ashamed to catch up. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't speak. The city lights passed in a blur as his grip tightened on the steering wheel. Knuckles' pale eyes fixed on the blinking red tail of the emergency vehicle ahead. When they arrived at the hospital, he parked far from the entrance, sitting in the driver's seat long after the ambulance doors had closed behind Kevin. Eventually, he forced himself out of the car, walked slowly to the emergency wing, and found a bench just outside the glass doors. He didn't go in. He couldn't. Inside was a world for people who belonged, family members, coaches, teammates. People who had earned the right to ask, "Is he okay?" Josh wasn't one of them. He just sat there, elbows on his knees, head bowed low, watching as nurses passed through the doors, as tired parents paced the lobby, as the hours stretched and the night deepened. His heart pulsed with a quiet ache, heavier with each minute. He imagined Kevin inside, hooked to monitors, joking with doctors, brushing off the pain the way young athletes always did. And it made him want to stand up, to walk in and say, "I'm here." But he didn't. He wasn't sure he had the right. Instead, he stayed outside, staring at the automatic doors, as if they might one day open and recognize him, as if the son he abandoned might somehow still feel his presence through the wall. But no one came. And Josh, once again, chose distance over courage. He didn't expect anyone to notice him. He had grown used to being invisible at the edges of Kevin's life, a shadow in the crowd, a nameless figure hiding behind a baseball cap and regret. But that night, as he sat hunched outside the emergency room, the automatic doors parted with a hiss and Kay walked out. She was holding her phone to her ear, speaking in a calm, focused tone, likely updating someone about Kevin's condition. Her heels clicked softly against the linoleum, her other hand clutching a tote bag filled with paperwork and snacks. At first, she didn't see him. Then, mid-sentence, her eyes scanned the hallway and stopped. Josh felt it the moment her gaze landed on him. Her voice paused. Her eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in recognition. She lowered the phone slowly, her steps slowing, her head tilting just slightly as if to confirm what her heart already knew. Josh stood up instinctively, almost out of guilt, as if being caught watching from afar required a silent confession. Kay stopped a few feet from him, still staring. Her face was unreadable, but not unkind. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked at him like someone trying to process the presence of a ghost. "Josh Cole," she said softly. Almost like a question, though she already knew the answer. He nodded once, lips pressed together, unsure whether to speak or run. But for the first time in years, he stayed. And the weight of being seen not by Kevin but by the woman who raised him was heavier than anything he'd felt in that gym. Kay didn't say another word. She looked at Josh for a long moment, eyes sharp, but not cruel, as if weighing everything he was and wasn't, what he had done and what he had failed to do. Then she turned and walked away, calm and purposeful, disappearing back through the hospital doors without waiting for an explanation or apology. Josh stood frozen in place, unsure whether to follow or vanish. He didn't. He simply returned to his car, the night air colder now, his breath fogging the windshield as he sat in silence. He thought the moment had passed, that their brief exchange, if it could even be called, that was over. But when he got out of the car the next morning, he found something tucked beneath his windshield wiper, a small piece of paper folded neatly, the handwriting unmistakably hers. His heart tightened as he unfolded it, hands trembling slightly from anticipation and something deeper. The note was brief, just one sentence written in clean, slanted ink. If you really want to know how the boy lives, come soon. He's leaving Boston this summer. That was it. No name, no phone number, no invitation. Just a deadline, a quiet dare, a window closing. Josh read the words over and over, standing beside his car in the early light of morning. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a gesture of forgiveness. It was a chance. And for the first time in years, someone had given him one. The question now was whether he would take it or let silence win again. The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet city, casting a soft orange hue across the empty streets and dew-covered rooftops. The basketball court behind the local rec center was silent, save for the rhythmic thump of a ball against concrete. Kevin was there alone, hoodie pulled over his head, earbuds in focused and methodical as he moved through his drills. Crossover, step back, jumper, again. The chain net clinked with each perfect shot, echoing into the stillness of morning. He didn't know anyone was watching. Across the street, behind a rusted chain-link fence, Josh stood motionless, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, breath visible in the cold air. He had come early before anyone else, just as the note had said. He hadn't slept much since Kay left it on his windshield. He's leaving Boston this summer. The words clung to him like fog, each syllable pressing urgency into his chest. This might be the last chance, the last window. Josh watched as Kevin moved with quiet intensity, sweat already forming on his brow, eyes locked on the invisible defenders only he could see. There was something sacred about the solitude of it. No cameras, no crowds, just a boy and the game that had clearly raised him. Josh didn't call out, didn't move closer. He stayed behind the fence, watching the son he had never held, never taught, never protected. But for the first time, he was there, not as a ghost, but as a man trying to find a way forward before the summer and his chance slipped away forever. Kevin didn't see him at first. He was too locked in moving, shooting, rebounding his own misses with the ease of muscle memory born from years of solitude on courts just like this. But eventually, between shots, he caught the movement beyond the fence. He paused, ball tucked under one arm, squinting into the rising light. And then he saw him, Josh, standing behind the fence like a man too late for his own life, hands in his pockets, eyes heavy with something that hovered between shame and longing. Kevin didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't storm off or demand answers. He simply held the ball for a moment, then took a slow step forward. Without a word, he cocked his arm back and tossed the ball hard and clean over the fence. It arced through the morning air, a perfect spiral, and landed with a solid bounce just in front of Josh's feet. Kevin didn't wait to see what he'd do with it. He turned back toward the court, picked up a second ball from his backpack, and resumed shooting the same calm rhythm, returning as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The throw wasn't angry. It wasn't playful. It was something else entirely, an invitation maybe, or a test. A message too layered for words. Josh stood frozen for a beat, staring at the ball in disbelief, unsure if he had imagined the whole thing. Then, slowly, cautiously, he bent down and picked it up. It was worn, broken in warm from Kevin's hands. He held it with both palms, unsure whether to step closer or stay exactly where he was. But for the first time, the distance between them didn't feel impossible. It felt like a question, one only courage could answer. Josh stared at the ball for a long moment, its textured surface still echoing with the force of Kevin's throw. It wasn't just leather and rubber, it was history weight, and something close to permission. He bent down and picked it up, both hands cradling it like it might fall apart if he held it too tightly. For a second, he just stood there, unsure of what to do, unsure if he had the right to even be holding it. Then slowly, almost involuntarily, a smile flickered across his face, worn, awkward, but real. It wasn't a joyful smile. It was the smile of a man standing at the edge of something unfamiliar and frightening, trying to hold on to a fragile thread of hope. Josh raised his eyes to the court. Kevin hadn't looked back. He was still shooting, still locked in his form perfect, his pace steady. But Josh knew the throw hadn't been random. It had been deliberate, silent, a wordless gesture that cracked open a door Josh had never believed he'd be allowed to knock on. He stepped forward, not onto the court, just a few paces closer to the fence, the ball still in his hands. His fingers tightened around it, feeling every scuff and scratch, proof that this wasn't brand new, that it had been used, lived and trusted. Just like Kevin. Josh let out a slow breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and gave a small, almost embarrassed nod as if to say, "Thank you, even if I don't deserve this." The smile never reached his eyes, but it stayed. And in that fragile, quiet moment, ball in hand, sun within reach, but still out of grasp, Josh felt the first fragile thread of connection begin to tremble into life. The sound of the basketball stopped. Another shot went up, swished through the chain net, and then silence. Kevin caught the rebound, held it under his arm, and turned slowly to face Josh. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The morning air hung thick with everything unspoken between them, years of absence. Questions never asked, wounds never acknowledged. Josh opened his mouth, not even sure what he was going to say. Maybe I'm sorry. Maybe I was scared. Maybe just his name. But before the words could come, Kevin cut through the silence, his voice clear and calm, but edged with a steel that came from learning to live without softness. "If you came to apologize," Kevin said, "don't bother. I don't need it." He didn't shout. He didn't shake with anger. He just stated it like a fact, like the weather, like the score at the end of a game that had already been played and won without him. Josh froze, the ball still in his hands, his attempted smile vanishing in an instant. Kevin's eyes didn't blink. He looked at Josh like someone who had already processed every possible version of this moment years ago and chosen not to let it control him. "I'm not angry," Kevin added after a pause. "I just don't need your guilt. It doesn't do anything for me." He turned and walked back to the three-point line, spun the ball in his hands, then launched another shot, perfect again. Josh stood behind the fence, hollowed out, but oddly relieved. Kevin's voice had been firm, but it hadn't closed the door completely. He didn't want apologies. He wanted truth. And now Josh would have to decide whether he was finally ready to give it. Josh stood still, the weight of Kevin's words pressing down on him like a judgment he knew he deserved. He looked at the ball in his hands one last time, then gently set it on the ground, as if laying down a shield. His throat tightened. But this time, he didn't let silence win. "I didn't come here to be forgiven," he said, his voice quiet but steady, carrying across the court like something sacred. Kevin didn't turn around, but he paused, the ball balanced on his fingertips, listening. "I know I gave up the right to be a part of your life the day I walked out," Josh continued. "I know I wasn't brave enough. I let fear of my family, of what it meant, of what people would say, dictate who I was. And I've regretted it every day since." His voice cracked just slightly, "but I'm not here to erase that. Here to erase. I'm not trying to fix it with words. I'm here because I needed to see the life you built, the life I didn't have the courage to stand beside. I needed to see that you're okay, that you became someone strong, someone better, even without me." Kevin remained still, eyes fixed ahead, but Josh could see the subtle shift in his shoulders. A breath held a thought considered. Josh didn't step forward. He didn't beg. He just stood there, stripped of all pretenses, finally honest. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but I'll be here on this side of the fence if you ever want me to stay." It wasn't redemption, it wasn't a reunion, but it was the truth. And sometimes the truth is the first brick in the bridge you never thought you'd be allowed to build. Kevin didn't respond right away. He stood in silence, letting Josh's words settle into the cold morning air, heavy but honest. Then without a word, he turned around, picked up the basketball Josh had gently set down, and bounced it once against the pavement. The sound echoed across the empty court. He looked up, met Josh's eyes for the briefest moment, not with warmth, not with forgiveness, but with something far more rare, acknowledgement. Then, with a quiet flick of his wrist, he passed the ball back across the fence. It bounced once, rolled gently to Josh's feet. Josh stared at it, stunned. Slowly, he picked it up, hands curling around the familiar texture like it might disappear if he blinked. He didn't speak. He didn't thank him. He just took a breath and tossed it back. Kevin caught it with ease, took 2 steps back, then passed it again. Back and forth. No scoreboard, no rules. Just the sound of rubber hitting concrete, the occasional squeak of sneakers against pavement, and the unspoken rhythm of 2 men who shared the same blood, but not the same past. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Each throw was a wordless offering, a fragile gesture that carried more meaning than any apology ever could. It wasn't about the game. It wasn't about fixing what had been broken. It was about showing up finally and staying long enough to let the silence do what words never could. With each pass, the space between them felt a little less wide. Josh stayed behind the fence, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a beginning, an invitation to keep coming back, not as a father asking for a title, but as a man willing to earn trust one throw at a time. Kevin walked into the apartment just as the late afternoon sun spilled across the hardwood floor, casting long golden streaks through the window blinds. Brenda was at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, while Kay sat nearby, flipping through a folder of college forms, her glasses perched low on her nose. The familiar rhythm of home quiet, steady, safe wrapped around him, but he didn't drop his bag or head straight to the shower like usual. Instead, he stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense in a way both women noticed immediately. Brenda looked up, first knife pausing mid-slice. "Kevin?" she asked, a hint of worry in her voice. He let out a slow breath and walked over to the couch, sitting heavily on the edge. Kay turned toward him too, her eyes already scanning his face for signs of injury or stress. "I saw him again," Kevin said quietly. The room fell still. "Josh. He was at the court this morning." Brenda put the knife down. Kay didn't move, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "He just watched for a while," Kevin continued. "Then I threw him the ball. He stayed behind the fence, didn't push, didn't ask anything. He said he just wanted to see that I was okay, that he wasn't brave enough to be there before." Brenda slowly walked around the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she approached her son. "How did that make you feel?" she asked softly. Kevin shrugged, looking down at his shoes. "I don't know," he admitted. "We didn't really talk, but we passed the ball, back and forth, for a while." Kay finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't owe him anything, Kevin. But if you ever want to know him even just a little, we'll support you, no matter what." Kevin looked up at the 2 women who had raised him. His voice was quiet but certain. "I'm not ready to forgive him, but I don't hate him either. I just want to understand." Brenda didn't respond right away. Her hands were clenched tightly around the dish towel knuckles, whitening as she stared at the floor. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second, not awkward, just thick with history. Kevin watched her closely, waiting, unsure if she'd raise her voice or simply walk away. But when she finally spoke, her voice was low, controlled, the kind of anger that had simmered for nearly 2 decades without ever boiling over. "I'm not surprised he showed up," she said, still staring at the space in front of her. "Cowards always return when it's safe, when the hardest part is already done for them." She turned her gaze to Kevin, now eyes filled not with rage but with the deep ache of someone who had once trusted the wrong person. "I remember sitting in that hospital bed, holding you in my arms, wondering how I was going to raise a child alone, while the man who helped create him walked out without a backward glance. He left a damn envelope, Kevin. An envelope. Like that made it right." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't let it fall apart. "And now, after all these years, he wants what a moment of peace for his conscience." She shook her head. "You owe him nothing." Across the room, Kay remained silent, watching Brenda, watching Kevin, her expression unreadable. She had always been the quieter one, the calm counterbalance to Brenda's fire. But her silence wasn't empty. It was layered with reflection, with restraint, and perhaps with something else too, understanding. She didn't jump in. She didn't try to soothe or interrupt. She simply let the moment be what it was. Kevin shifted slightly on the couch, absorbing both women's reactions like gravity pressing on two sides. "I know," he said softly. "I know what he did. But I also know I'm not that scared little boy anymore. I want to know who he is. Not for him, for me." Brenda's jaw tightened, but she nodded slowly. Kay still said nothing, but she reached out and gently placed her hand over Brenda's. That silence in its own way said enough. Kevin sat quietly for a few moments, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers clasped together as if trying to hold something fragile that wasn't quite real. The room remained heavy with everything Brenda had just said, and the silence that Kay still hadn't broken. But when he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, not defensive, not uncertain, just honest. "I don't know if I need him," he said, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor like it held the answer he'd been chasing. "I've made it this far without him. You raised me. You gave me everything I needed. Both of you." He glanced briefly at Brenda, then Kay. "And I don't want you to think that's ever been lost on me. I know who my real family is." Brenda's lips tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Kevin continued, his voice softer now. "But something happened when I saw him this morning. The way he looked at me. The way he didn't try to force anything. It was like he knew exactly how much he didn't deserve to be there, and still he came." He paused, trying to find the right words. "I'm not saying that makes him brave or good. I'm not saying it changes the past. But for 17 years I told myself he disappeared because I didn't matter, that I wasn't enough for someone to stay. And now—" Kevin's voice trailed off for a second. He took a breath. "Now I know that's not completely true. He didn't disappear forever. He's still there on the edges maybe, but not gone. And I didn't realize how much that meant until today." Brenda looked at him, her eyes softening wounded pride and maternal love, pulling at each other in equal measure. "I'm not letting him in," Kevin clarified gently. "Not yet. Maybe never. But I'm not pretending he's a ghost anymore either." Kay finally leaned forward, her voice quiet but warm. "Sometimes knowing someone's still there, even if they're far, is enough to let you breathe differently." Kevin nodded, not quite smiling. "Yeah," he said. "It doesn't fix anything. But it's something." The sky over Boston was a soft, endless gray that morning, neither threatening rain nor promising sun, just quiet, steady, and still. On the university lawn, rows of folding chairs lined the grass in perfect symmetry, each one filled with proud parents, buzzing classmates, and the occasional nervous professor fumbling with notes. But there were no cameras, no reporters, no television crews. Kevin had made sure of that. He'd told the school firmly but respectfully that he didn't want media coverage. Not today. Not for this. This moment wasn't about headlines or scholarship stats or viral clips of a basketball star in a cap and gown. It was personal, intimate, a chapter closing not just on his education, but on a life he had fought tooth and nail to claim as his own. Somewhere beyond the crowd, tucked among the anonymous guests, Josh sat near the back, a simple program folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the stage even though his name wasn't written anywhere in the ceremony. He hadn't been invited, but he hadn't been asked to leave either, and that after all these years was enough. Brenda sat in the front row holding a bouquet of white calla lilies, her posture proud and upright, her hand occasionally brushing against Kay's. Kevin stood backstage adjusting the tassel on his cap, taking a deep breath. He wasn't nervous about the speech, there wasn't one. He wasn't thinking about cameras or scholarships or scouts. He was thinking about the years behind him, the early mornings, the aching muscles, the quiet conversations with Brenda, after long days, the meals Kay cooked when he was too tired to think, the long silences he'd spent staring into mirrors, wondering who he really was. And maybe, just maybe, the man sitting quietly near the back of the crowd, watching but not claiming, regretting, but not running. This day was his. No noise, no spotlight, just truth. And that was more than enough. Kevin's name was called clearly over the modest sound system, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow into one single path. The stage, the stairs, the outstretched hand holding his diploma. He walked forward with quiet confidence, the weight of the black gown swaying with each step, his cap perfectly square on his head despite the spring breeze trying to shift it. As he reached the podium, he didn't rush. He wasn't the kind of person who soaked in applause or scanned the crowd for validation. But this moment, this walk across the stage meant something more than recognition. It was the culmination of every quiet battle fought in silence, every drop of sweat on the court, every late-night study session, every time he told himself he didn't need a father to make it this far. He accepted the diploma with a firm handshake, nodded respectfully to the dean, and then paused just for a second at center stage. That's when he looked out toward the crowd. He saw Brenda first, her smile, proud eyes wet, but unblinking, clutching the calla lilies like they were anchor and celebration all in one. Beside her, Kay had her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression soft and still, like someone quietly praying that the boy they raised knew just how deeply he was loved. And then farther back, near the edge of the crowd where no one was taking photos or clapping too loudly, Kevin saw him, Josh, standing, not waving, not drawing attention, just standing. Their eyes met briefly. Kevin didn't smile, didn't nod, but he didn't look away. And in that brief flicker of recognition, amid a crowd that knew him as an athlete or a scholar, Kevin saw the man who once walked out standing still, doing the hardest thing of all, staying. Then he turned, stepped off the stage, and walked forward into the next chapter, not alone, not defined by absence, but whole and finally free. Josh sat at the very back, his posture straight but tense, as if his body hadn't yet decided whether it truly belonged in that space. He hadn't expected a seat, let alone one beside Brenda and Kay. When he'd arrived early alone and unsure, he had stood near the edges of the ceremony, willing to watch from afar if that was all that was allowed. But then Kay had turned, seen him hovering beneath the shade of an elm tree, and without a word gestured to the empty seat beside her. Brenda hadn't looked at him at first. She didn't offer a smile or a greeting, but she hadn't objected either. That in itself was a gift Josh hadn't expected. So there he sat, awkward, in his wrinkled blazer fingers, gripping the rolled-up ceremony program like a lifeline, trying to stay still, to breathe, to simply witness the moment he'd once forfeited the right to dream about. Kay sat to his left, composed and warm in her silence. Brenda to his right was utterly focused on Kevin's shoulders squared back, straight, pride radiating from every part of her being. Josh didn't try to insert himself. He didn't make small talk. He barely moved. But when Kevin's name was called and the crowd applauded, he found himself clapping softly, almost without realizing it, the sound of his own hands startling in his ears. And when Kevin's eyes scanned the crowd and landed just briefly on theirs, Josh felt something crack open inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but permission to be there, to sit in the sun among the people who had raised Kevin and never once abandoned him. He didn't expect a second chance. He didn't expect to be part of family photos or post-graduation celebrations. But in that single moment, seated beside the two women who had done everything he hadn't, Josh allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in years present. Not hidden, not haunted, just there. And for now, that was enough. They sat side by side, three people bound not by affection or shared memories, but by a boy who had grown into a man despite everything, perhaps because of everything. The folding chairs beneath them creaked softly each time someone shifted, and the murmurs of the crowd faded into the background, as if the world knew to quiet itself for what was unfolding in the silence between them. Brenda didn't speak, didn't look Josh's way, but her body was no longer stiff with anger. There was no more heat in her silence, no flinching, just stillness, the kind that follows years of grief, struggle, and finally surrender. She didn't forgive him, but she didn't fight him either. And in her stillness there was something that resembled peace. Kay, ever the quiet observer, sat between them like a gentle bridge, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression soft but firm. She had seen it all, the pain, the abandonment, the long, slow healing, and now she bore witness to something even rarer, the possibility of coexistence, not reconciliation, not yet, but something less fragile than tolerance and more generous than resentment. Josh didn't dare move too much or breathe too loudly, as if any misstep might shatter this strange, delicate arrangement. He knew he didn't belong in their world, not fully, but for the first time he wasn't trying to escape it either. He was there because Kevin had allowed it. Because Kay had invited him. Because Brenda hadn't sent him away. And together, the three of them watched the boy they all had a claim to, each in their own way, walk across a stage, accept a diploma, and step into a future none of them could predict. There were no apologies exchanged, no attempts to rewrite the past, just the sound of applause, the rustle of gowns, and the quiet understanding that despite everything they were all here, not as enemies, not quite as friends, but as people who had once been broken by the same story, now sitting in the same row, learning slowly, imperfectly, how to let that story change. As Kevin stepped down from the stage, the weight of the moment still lingering in the air like a fragile mist, he moved steadily through the crowd, his cap and gown brushing softly against the sea of proud families and well-wishers. His eyes scanned the faces until they settled on the small cluster at the back of the auditorium. Josh, Kay, and Brenda sitting side by side. For a brief, almost imperceptible instant, time seemed to pause. The noise of chatter, the shuffle of feet, the distant echo of applause all faded away as Kevin's gaze locked with Josh's. It wasn't a stare filled with accusation or resentment, nor was it an overly warm look of immediate forgiveness. It was something quieter, more nuanced, a subtle nod, the faintest tilt of the head that said, "I see you." Josh felt his heart tighten, a mixture of relief and uncertainty swirling in his chest. That tiny gesture held so much weight, the acknowledgement of a presence, a recognition of a connection that had taken years to even surface. Kevin's eyes were steady calm, not pleading for anything, but not pushing away either. It was as if he was silently telling Josh that the past, with all its mistakes and pain, was part of their story now, but it wouldn't define their future unless they let it. Josh managed a small, tentative smile in return, grateful for the fragile bridge that nod had built between them. Kay and Brenda noticed the exchange, their expressions softening ever so slightly, the tension easing just a fraction as hope flickered quietly in the room. As Kevin continued on, weaving through the crowd with a purposeful stride, Josh sat back, the lump in his throat refusing to dissolve. That nod was a beginning, not a promise, not a resolution, but the first step on a long road towards something new. And for the first time in many years, Josh dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't impossible. The ceremony carried on around them, but in that moment, amid the applause and celebration, a silent understanding passed between father and son, a gesture small enough to miss but powerful enough to hold on to. Josh sat quietly in the back row, his posture relaxed, yet attentive, a gentle smile curving his lips as he watched the ceremony unfold. There were no tears escaping his eyes, no sudden waves of overwhelming emotion threatening to break through the carefully maintained calm. Instead, his smile was soft, almost shy, like the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had finally learned what it meant to truly be present in a moment that once would have been too painful to face. Years of regret, avoidance, and silence had weighed on him like a heavy cloak, but here, surrounded by people who represented both his past mistakes and tentative hopes for the future, Josh found a new kind of peace settling within. It wasn't the kind of joy that erupts in exuberance or applause. It was quieter, deeper, a subtle warmth that spread slowly through his chest and radiated outward in the curve of his lips and the steady calm in his eyes. He thought about all the years he'd spent running away, hiding from the truth, refusing to accept the consequences of his actions, and how that had only distanced him from the people who mattered most. But now, watching Kevin move confidently across the stage, graduating with strength and dignity, Josh understood that presence was more than just physical. It was about accepting the past without being chained to it, about showing up, even when it was hard, about finding courage in vulnerability. That smile was his quiet vow, a sign that he was ready to be a part of Kevin's life in whatever way the future allowed, not as a perfect father, but as a man willing to try, willing to witness, willing to be there without conditions or excuses. It was the smile of someone who had finally learned how to live in the moment and embrace the imperfect beauty of their fractured family. And as the applause echoed through the hall, washing over him like a gentle tide, Josh let himself simply be present, hopeful, and at peace. Life often teaches us in the most unexpected ways that the past cannot be changed, but how we choose to face it defines our future. Josh's story is a powerful reminder that running from our mistakes or hiding from painful truths only deepens the wounds not just for ourselves but for those around us. It takes courage to admit where we have failed to confront the parts of ourselves we wish to ignore and to show up honestly even when forgiveness feels impossible. Healing doesn't happen overnight, and relationships don't magically fix themselves, but every small step toward openness, accountability, and presence lays the foundation for real change. Whether it's with family, friends, or within ourselves, the hardest but most meaningful work is to be vulnerable enough to rebuild trust and to accept that progress is often imperfect and slow. Most importantly, Josh's journey reminds us that love and connection aren't about perfection or flawless history. They are about the willingness to be present, to listen, and to grow alongside one another. So, if there is someone in your life with whom you need to make peace, whether it's your child, a parent, a friend, or even yourself, start small. Show up. Speak honestly. Listen without judgment. Healing begins when we stop hiding and start trying, no matter how late it feels. If Josh's story moved you or made you reflect, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. Don't forget to save this video so you can revisit these lessons whenever you need a reminder. And if you want to hear more stories about real-life courage, redemption, and family, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Together, let's learn to face our truths and build stronger, kinder connections every day.